let's just get right into it.
俺はルフィ、海賊王になる男だ。
It's a great day here at KEKFILA's YouTube channel. I am the KEKFILA, and I have a little video here for a top 16 list for cards of One Piece TCG of 2023, the most impactful cards. I will include a lot of honorable mentions, and I'm going to go based on color, and I do want to put here a trigger warning. The trigger warning is that I will probably talk crap about your favorite color. This video will be formatted like it's a top 10 list, but I will go over the honorable mentions. I will go over actually color by color, and then I will probably talk about every single card, have some sort of little discussion from my end. And I do want to say that this is a very biased opinion, especially when I talk about the card. However, on Twitter, I did ask you all the most impactful cards of 2023. And I do want to say that this is basically based off of your guys' opinions. So here it is. I do also want to clarify that I do not want to include any cards from OP05. And I'm not going to include any cards from OP04.5, the trial deck. And the main reason why I'm not going to include those is because we haven't had a lot of time with that in the English format. And even though those cards are very impactful, I'll at least mention them at some point in this video. But this video is not going to include those. And I appreciate you guys all watching this again. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. And without further ado, let's get into the goo. For this video, I'm actually going to start out with purple. I do find that purple was probably the least represented and topping deck. However, I do find that, you know, I found it a special place in my heart that it's played, and obviously it got a lot of support at the very end of 2023 with the ST10 deck. But because this is kind of a top list where I don't include those cards, it's probably more toward the bottom there. And you know, I have a faint love for purple as well. But we'll just go into it. The honorable mentions I do want to say for purple, and I'm actually will include one trial deck card because it was brought up so often in my Twitter video, is 4-cost law. That 4-cost law that makes your opponent discard 2 cards is pretty strong. That's basically it. People find that that's pretty powerful, but purple didn't really have a lot of impactful cards. I do want to say as another honorable mention will be Hell's Judgment. This should probably be in the list. However, I decided that essentially I felt good, but it never made you win the game. Obviously, I'm sure people have lost the game due to Hell's Judgment against their opponent, but I felt like it wasn't as impactful as might be. So without further ado, let's get into the top 16. Number 16. For this card, it's going to be Kaido. Kaido 9-drop. Obviously, very good in the trial deck format, but coming into this actual set, it ended up only being kind of used as a finisher in green-purple Doflamingo, and also really not used too much in Magellan. It was kind of a shock whenever you saw this card. Obviously, very powerful at the beginning of the format when you had options to use this, but generally, I find that this card was a little undershadowed, but a lot of you guys liked the 9-drop and felt it was pretty strong, and I do want to do a slight mention of the 10-drop. The 10-drop obviously could remove boards, and that was pretty powerful for the time being in OP01. Number 15. For number 15, we're going to start with Magellan. Magellan was kind of an interesting card. I do also want to say, I always said this, you can't say Magellan and not smile. Magellan actually threw a big curve off, and a lot of times you'd face opponents and they actually didn't know what to do against you. You actually were able to keep a sticky board on top of the rest of his kit. The main thing is that Magellan ended up being really, really, really oppressive if you saw multiple of them, and so that's why Magellan's on this list. Card 14. And at number 14, and the best card in purple, at least by you guys' standards, is actually 5-cost Queen. Now, it's so funny. Just a regular 5-cost blocker that draws 2, discards 1, in a deck that had a lot of bad cards. So sometimes drawing 2, discarding 1 is the same as drawing 2. And, you know, it's kind of big telling that purple really struggled this year when your best card is just a blocker. And I don't think I've ever had a case where my opponent played 4 queens and I lost because they played 4 queens. It's not something people usually complained about. Obviously, it's very annoying, and it was a very impactful card because of the tempo purple had. But that was your guys' vote, and what you guys talked about as being the most impactful purple card of 2023. Next is actually the color black. I do want to bring up actually some honorable mentions, and an OPO5. This was very highly talked about. Again, in my video, I'm not including any OPO5 cards, but the 4-cost Rebecca and the 5-cost Lucci, which is going to be very oppressive very quite soon. I'm sure we're all going to know how strong or impactful these cards are. However, for this video, we're not including them, but want to at least mention that. And an honorable mention for this is actually Sabo. The black 5-cost Sabo was a honorable mention to bring into this, and I will go into the card. Big 13. Now, for your 13th most impactful card, I decided to put in Borsalino, and it was by far the most overvoted card for 2023 black. And it's your only card that I'm including in this because it was so voted, and it's really hilarious because when Borsalino came out, it was actually extremely impactful because of the effect of just being sticky. It would just stay on the field. Jet Pistol couldn't deal with it. And it was a very frustrating moment where sometimes your opponent would have 2 to 3 Borsalinos, and you would never lose you just never lose. Sometimes you just play 3 or 4 Borsalinos, you can't lose because you played so many of these. It was such an interesting effect on that point. But with black being so lackluster, I kind of kept it more down this list, and there really wasn't any other giant impactful cards that I found from black, even though obviously there's good cards, don't get me wrong, it's a real color, but it just felt a little less impactful than the rest of our cards on our list. The next color I'm going into is actually going to be yellow. Yellow came out in OPO3, so we've only had it for 2 sets. And there's obviously OPO5 cards, but I don't have any on this list. But with this, the impactfulness I'm going to first mention is some honorable mentions. And that's first honorable mention is 8-cost Katakuri. This was our first big removal that we can actually do with 8-drop Kid, and people pretty much played around that. That was very powerful at the time, the 8-drop Katakuri, and I felt like it was the only good removal in yellow, still might be the only good removal in yellow, but that's the other card that's coming up is 9-cost Yamato. I actually found this card was very impactful, but by your guys' standards of impact, it probably didn't actually make that list, but I do want to say 9-cost Yamato filled that gap of what yellow wants to do. It wants to be annoying. It wants to gain life. It wants to make bodies, and it wants to remove board. Well, it doesn't want to remove board, but Yamato for some reason did that, right? So it actually answered that question of we need a card that removes and gains life, and they just put that in one card. So with that, that's your honorable mentions for yellow. 12. Beige Capone, just a 3-cost 3K as a 2K counter. That's the good part about it, but I had a trigger that forces your opponent not to attack when you trigger this out of life. Obviously, any trigger cards are very impactful. There's blockers you can get out of life, but for some reason, this added another layer, and trust me, I've won games off of hitting Capone Beige, and it ended up being, quite hilarious, and was definitely a frustration and definitely an impactful card. Card number 11. And for your best card in yellow, that actually was 10-drop Lin Lin. Charlotte Lin Lin, coming into the game, it felt a little too strong. It is a little too strong. I actually feel like they need to errata this card so you can't play 2 back-to-back. You can maybe hopscotch it. People are actually asking this card to get maybe even restricted or banned, and it's kind of one-dimensional where it ends up beating any deck that wants to go late game. Obviously, decks have ways around that forces them to be a little more dynamic and fast. It also forces maybe Katakuri to be a little less reliant on that because of what you have to do against it. But 10-drop Mom really forces your opponent to play and actually be aggressive into Katakuri, and that's why it's on this list. As your next color, I'm going to be talking about blue. My favorite color of One Piece. And the honorable mentions, I do want to do a slight honorable mention for OPO5, and that's Icehound. And that is a problem that's going on. It's just a event card that removes. Very, very strong. You're going to see this card. This card's obviously, I think, a little too strong, in my opinion. And hopefully they do something about this in OPO5, but it is what it is. It's going to make this list as a little bit of an honorable mention. And then another honorable mention is actually 3,000 Worlds. I'm sure you guys will see a card later in this that kind of looks a lot like this, but 3,000 Worlds answered cards like Borsalino or Magellan, cards that were just really sticky and you couldn't get rid of in normal ways by KOing, but you can bottom deck them and really abuse that. It ended up being very frustrating for most people to play against, and most people, when they play down a vanilla card, they just see a 3,000 Worlds, they obviously were frustrated and they sometimes had to play into it, and it was obviously a very good card to mulligan for and see really early on in any blue deck that you saw, and that's why it's part of the honorable mentions. Top 10. For your first blue card in this top 16 list, you're going to have actually 9-drop Mihawk. A lot of you guys felt that one was really impactful. Having the large body, and for a long time, this card wasn't removable until Red Rock was in the game, and it removed a lot of big options. It didn't remove 8-cost Kid, but it did do a lot of work. It ended up being the big beater of all the blue decks, and sometimes in the mirror, that's how you just won the game. So that's why it's on this list. Top 9. Red Rock. Now, this is a card that came out in OPO4 and having such a big impact, being able to remove any card. It's a lot. Well, it works the exact same way as 3,000 Worlds, costs 2 more Dawn, and then ended up being a way to play around your opponent. Obviously, very good with Queen, very good with Crocodile. You can play it in any blue deck, but generally, you're probably not going to see it a lot in OPO5 with Sakazuki, because you can just reduce the levels with black. But Red Rock will be here and probably be a very frustrating card for most people to play, because they are actually afraid to play big drops against blue because of Red Rock. Red Rock will just ruin your whole entire turn playing a 10-drop or a 9-drop, and then seeing a Red Rock that same turn is very frustrating, and that's why it's on this list. Top 8. And the number one most impactful blue card you guys said was 3-cost Doflamingo, and that kind of speaks a lot to the card pool. It ends up being a blocker, a 3-cost, 4K power, 1K counter. A very good stat line, may I add you. That card ended up being the most impactful for you guys, but it looks at top 5 cards of the deck. Obviously, we know searchers are very strong, but a scry skill, we look at top 5, and was very, very usable and abusable in things like Blue Doflamingo. This would be used in any blue deck, and probably most blue decks, not everyone, most blue decks going forward, because it's just a good blocker. On top of, the crazy thing is, when you look at top 5 cards of your deck, your hand is now an extension of your deck, and your deck is an extension of your hand. So you know what you're going to get the next turn, so you can actually play more around that. And even better, if you have 2 of them, or maybe just 1, you just don't care, you can bottom deck those 5, because you need to see more impactful cards, and that definitely made a big difference. And this card's definitely a keep in every blue deck going forward, and that's why it's on the top of this blue top 16 list. For the next color, I'll be going over green, and some honorable mentions will actually be Punk Gibson. Punk Gibson was just an event card that rested a 4-cost and gave 4K. People have to play around it, and out of trigger, I can't tell you how many games I've lost because Punk Gibson came out of life and rested one of my beaters or my blockers, and it's the most frustrating thing. And how some people have a bluff Gibson, they just keep 2 Dawn up, and it's such a frustrating thing to worry about, and that's why it's on here. Another honorable mention is actually the 5-cost Yamato, the secret rare. I actually called this card bad for a very long time, and to be honest, I kind of hold the same sentiment, but you guys on Twitter thought it was actually at least worth a mention, because this card has probably won you games or lost you games, especially more recently, and that's why it's on the list. And my last honorable mention is actually Bonnie. Bonnie, this green 1-cost searcher, ended up being pretty much the backbone of red-green law. And honestly, it's just super frustrating when you just see this card keep going off every turn after turn. It's your target every time you're trying to kill it. And if you don't see it as green, you're probably struggling. So that is your honorable mentions for green. Top 7. Now, as far as the top 16 list for this, I will start off with Nami. Nami is a film package, ended up being very impactful. At first, I felt this card wasn't that great, but as things went on, ended up being a search engine and a plus engine in a actually extremely consistent deck. There was a lot of vanillas in this deck, but as we know, vanillas are very, very strong because of their stat line, and Phil Nami helped with that search. So there we go. Top 6. 5-drop blocker law. Pretty much the whole entire deck was centered around this card, which was red-green law. You did see some decks early on play this card. You still actually might see a lot of green decks play this card because of the insane value. I still think this card is too bonkers for what it does. It really, picking up it can pick up a 1 cost and then put down a 3 cost. It ended up being really aggressive, especially playing down things like Red Zoro. But yeah, that's why it made our list. 5 golden rings. And your most impactful green card voted by you guys was actually 8-cost Green Kid. If you played anything in OP01, this deck dominated. Ended up being such an insane card where your opponent just had to play around that. You'd see mirrors go on for a very long time. Whoever attacked each other first lost, actually. That was the goal. Whoever saw most 8-cost kids was great. The card wasn't very removable. There was a removable thing in purple, but that wasn't the most played. Obviously, red can also remove it with a handful of cards. But this card ended up being the whole entire meta of OP01, and obviously from then on, people still play this card, and it ends up being really impactful, and that's why it made the top of our green for this top 16 list. Now, for your red package and the final color of this 2023 list, I do want to give out some honorable mentions. And the first mention is actually going to be 3-cost Zoro. I am sure all of you have had an issue where you thought, oh, this card was really strong, really overpowered. How do I deal with it? This card wins games. I have to play around it. And your opponent could play really dynamic. They never even had to play the Zoro. But that's why it made that list. And the other honorable mention I want to talk about is 5-cost Luffy. 5-cost Luffy. I can't tell you how many games this card has won. This card has won so many games and ends up being almost oppressive, but just being able to get through a blocker and generate that, it definitely was a card people played around a little bit, but wasn't the most impactful, but it did win games. Maybe that can be the biggest impact, but voted by you guys, you felt like that maybe this didn't make the cut that we're looking for. The final honorable mention of this whole entire thing in N4 Red is Jet Pistol, Gum Jet Pistol. I know you don't see it a lot now in OP04, but I will tell you in OP01 and even OP02, this was the most annoying freaking card that ever existed. This card was so frustrating, and people had to play around it. They had to put a lot of on. Every red deck built this. There wasn't very many. And you wanted to play a lot of these, and I tell you, there was times in OP01, OP02, I know a lot of people that lost because Jet Pistol out of life. I'm sure many people have lost and won thousands of dollars because of a very timely Jet Pistol out of life, and that's why it's on this list. Top 4. The red search engine. That's very basic, and a lot of people on Twitter basically we're just saying things like the Dawn, Nami Searcher, Ezo, etc., Buggy, and it ended up being just this big search engine of 1-drops and 2-drops. Ended up being really impactful, and basically a Zoro, which is basically based off that, and that won a lot of games. It was overwhelmingly really strong, and I can't really target it on one card. You can say it's the Dawn, you can say it's Nami, but it really was a culmination of all of these cards put together. So that's why it made it here on the list. Top 3. The next card is actually Rad Beam, and maybe I can extend that a little bit to guard points. I do want to say it felt really frustrating that Red had the best defensive options while also being the most aggressive deck. And that's why even cards like 4-cost blocker Marco felt really oppressive because it was the best blocker in the game. And honestly, just was super frustrating to deal with things like Rad Beam because the deck would go down to low life anyway and have so much counter. And really, it's actually really frustrating. Not a lot of cards have cheap counter like that, but now they do. A lot of decks do have their own Rad Beam, but it kind of makes sense for those decks. They're not the most aggressive deck as Red, so hopefully Rad Beam stays at 1 going forward, but I do want to at least mention it for this video. Your runner-up, number 2, on Twitter, you guys actually really posted this guy, 9-Beard, 9-drop Edward Newgate. This card ended up being sort of a big meta, and honestly kind of an oppressive card when you've seen 1 or 2 of these, especially when you're playing Newgate and you stay at like a 1 to 2 life. And it was a defensive card because your leader got big, and it was a defensive card because it removed cards when attacking and was just a tall giant monster no one can get around. And that's why it was limited to 1, because it felt not very fun to play against someone who dropped multiple Newgates in a row. I personally would love to see Edward Newgate come back, but maybe with a little errata saying you can't play 2 in a row. That's my personal thing, but it definitely was a card people played around, and that's why it's on this list. And your number 1 most impactful card, Otama. Otama was by far the most talked about card, especially in Red, in this list entirely. This 1-cost 2K reduced 2K power card is played in every Red deck. If it isn't, there's an argument for it to be played, and that's because it's awesome cheap removal, and if you don't use it, it's counter that you can get out of an attack with. And it was searchable with the Dan, and it's even searchable with Ezo, I believe, and it was comboed with any removal cards. This card comboed with Jet Pistol, it comboed with Fire Fist, it comboed with 5-cost Marco, which should be a honorable mention, by the way, but it is all there, and ended up being, pretty much the most impactful card. You could say this card's probably one of the more frustrating cards I can think about when I play against Red Green Lawn. And if you combine this card with 5-cost Law, they would play this card, play down a 5-cost Law, pick it back up, put down a Vista, kill that, and they would have it again for next turn or a counter. They just sit on these all day. And these 2K counters, they ended up having terrible skills, but this is an amazing skill for also having 2K counter, and that's why it is number 1 on our list. I do want to thank you all for watching. I do want to see your comments down below in the comments. Make sure you guys follow me on Twitter. Make sure you like this video and subscribe. And if you're not, come check me out on Twitch. I'll probably be playing a ton of World of Warcraft Season of Discovery. My birthday is on December 2nd, so I will just be playing a lot of WoW for December. And just come check me out at twitch.tv/KEKFILA. And, make sure you guys leave those comments down below again. I will see you all in the next video. Ciao.